not dead. Oh. Oh. Jesus. Hey guys, Borside here. Today I'd like to dive into the rich history of the M16 rifle. Well, at least for the period from 1957 to 1979, as there aren't any newer iterations of this gun in the game. Right, so it's worth mentioning that the designs for the M16 nearly ended up being discarded. The evolution of this rifle is a fascinating story involving politics, strategies, and quite a few mishaps. Now, at first glance, the M16 may look like just a toy. Its materials make it very lightweight, and due to its design, there is little to no recoil. But make no mistake, this weapon is the bringer of death. The M16 is known as the Vietnam gun, but the idea of creating a lightweight machine gun is an idea that designers and weapon engineers have been involved with since the late 40s. For a decade or so, the idea remained exactly that. An idea, nothing more. With the advent of the Korean War, the US government was looking for a weapon that could replace the M1 Garand, which was the standard issue military rifle at the time, as well as the M1 carbine. So the American infantrymen fighting in Korea needed more firepower than the M1 could provide, and there was a growing demand and undeniable need for a better assault weapon, one which the US troops could stand behind. The Chinese were also using old World War II weapons, but they had sheer numbers on their side. Now, many battles in Korea were close-quarter combat situations. This, perhaps more than anything, demonstrated the need for a new kind of weapon, one which could be operated in varying conditions and one which would give the US troops an advantage against the larger numbers of the enemy. Now, a trained soldier could fire 50 rounds a minute with the M1, and this was not nearly enough, considering you were confronted by hundreds or even thousands of enemy troops that were running towards you. Now, out of this great need, the idea of the M16 was born. A lightweight assault rifle which could be operated easily and which could compensate for the lack of accuracy on the shooter's part, and which would allow many more rounds per minute and improve success at short-range battles. The idea of short-range combat was one which went against a firmly held belief, bordering on myth, which was part of the heritage of the US Armed Forces. That belief was that long-range combat is the best way to win a war. One shot, one kill. This harks back to the days of the American Revolution, when a claim that America won the war because of its sharpshooters was laid. The idea stuck, and it was perpetuated during World War I with stories of American marksmen wiping out the enemy using heavy caliber long-range weapons. Now, in 1950, during the Korean War, this idea went under the microscope of the US Army's analysts and specialists. These individuals studied infantry operations and weapon usage in Korea, and they found that in most cases an infantryman would hold his fire until the enemy was within 183 meters. In other words, it became clear that a long-range weapon was not as necessary as initially thought. Something new needed to rise from the ashes of the M1, and that something was the M14. Now, the M14 was very similar to the M1, but it had a 30-round magazine. There was a great downside though, accuracy. It was very poor when in full automatic mode. Recoil was harsh, and follow-up shots were not proving to be as accurate as the first shot. Even in the hands of a trained soldier, full auto mode was a problem. In semi-automatic mode, however, the M14 was a definite improvement over the M1. So, a man by the name of Eugene Stoner stepped up to the plate. He was an engineer, inventor, designer, and the father of the modern-day M16. In the 1950s, Stoner was the chief engineer and designer at a company named Armalite, a division of Fairchild Aircraft. He had the idea of using fiberglass aluminum alloys and advanced and lightweight materials which were used in aircraft industry to create a new kind of weapon. Stoner died in 1997, but his designs have revolutionized the world. Now, the US Army began to notice Stoner and Armalite when the AR-10 assault rifle grabbed their attention. It was incredibly lightweight at 3.17 kilograms, it fired 7.62mm caliber rounds, and it had a 20-round magazine. It was very versatile. In spite of its many positive attributes, the Army chose not to develop it. Combined with the fact that the military saw no real problem with the M14, it was decided that the AR-10 was not the weapon for the military. In 1957, though, a 4-star general named Weinman paid a visit to the Armalite facilities in California. He told Stoner that he was interested in developing an AR series for the military, and Stoner went on to create the AR-15. This was the earliest version of what would later become the M16. Now, the AR-15 was made primarily out of fiberglass and aluminium. Only the barrel, along with a few other parts, were made out of steel. Now, this was a huge advantage, as it was one which was met with great enthusiasm. It had semi or fully automatic capabilities, and it could fire a 25-round magazine. Now, the AR-15 was a marvel, and it was powered by a sophisticated gas system. It weighed just under 2.3 kilograms, had a backlight grip and thin barrel, as well as a 3-prong flash suppressor. Now, the backlight grip was very light and fragile material, which could very easily be broken. It was a good weapon, but it wasn't reliable. The original AR-15 used smaller .22 caliber projectiles, whose ballistic range was shorter and was more susceptible to the interference of weather conditions. The army wanted something more soldier-like, which could withstand the punishment, be it at the hands of the common infantryman or the elements. Now, the AR-15 had one major advantage, and that's its weight. This was the game changer. Soldiers could carry a lot more AR-15 ammunition than the M14. 3 times as much actually, and this was one thing which the army could not ignore. It was very clear, even back then, that the AR-15 had great potential. However, due to bureaucracy, politics, and ego, the AR-15 was passed on. This rifle had a very tough time getting approval of the army. It was thought that issuing lower caliber weapons would be a step backwards for the infantry. Plus, there were those who did not like the fact that a weapon was designed by an outsider. They wanted the US troops to use an in-house designed weapon platform. So in 1958, General Weyman, who had always believed in Stoner, gave the go-ahead for official tests to be conducted on the AR-15. Army officials were impressed with the performance of the AR-15, and they saw no major disadvantages. However, when further testing was done in the Arctic region, the AR-15 performed poorly. It was malfunctioning, inaccurate, and unreliable. Now, some claim that those 1958 Arctic tests were fixed in order for the AR-15 to be marked as a failure. When word of the poor performance reached Stoner, he flew to the testing grounds to witness and oversee the operations firsthand. What Stoner saw when he arrived was that the rifles had been tampered with. Certain pieces were taken off the weapons and other inferior pieces were put in their place. This caused parts to be misaligned and rendered the gun inoperable. The officers at the testing range were somewhat hostile towards Stoner, and they did not want his design to be successful. Some would say that the army had already shown how much they were not interested in Stoner's new weapon. But it wasn't all ego and pride. There were other more conservative, more realistic reasons for the army being wary of the AR-15. The rifle which would be in line to replace the M14 would have to be one which could protect its carrier. Army officials refused to believe that a small caliber weapon like the AR-15 would be sufficient, and they saw it not only as a flawed design, but also as a liability and a danger to those who would be holding it. The last thing these generals wanted was a standard issue rifle which could potentially harm US soldiers. The AR-15 received its share of praise and positive reinforcement from fellow engineers and designers, but after the 1958 tests were done, the army had dropped all interest in the project, and the official report stated that the AR-15 did not have sufficient merit to be seriously considered as a standard issue infantry combat rifle. The army didn't want to develop the AR-15, but the civilian company Colt bought the manufacturing rights from Armalite and began marketing the AR-15 around the world with an aggressive and enthusiastic campaign. Colt, based in Hartford, knew what they were doing, and they had enough experience to know a good thing when they saw it. They marketed the AR-15 as both an assault rifle and a competition gun. One Air Force general, a man by the name of Curtis LeMay, attended a 4th of July picnic hosted by the gun industry. A Colt representative set up targets and handed the general an AR-15. LeMay was so impressed with the weapon's performance that he ordered 80,000 units right then and there. The general had been looking for a new rifle, and he thought the AR-15 would be perfect for defending Air Force bases. Congress, however, was skeptical, and they stopped the general's order before it was even put through. The move was not approved because the country was not actively involved in any military confrontations. Fast forward several months later, and in January 1961, there was a change in the Oval Office. JFK got the keys to the White House, and he also got a growing problem which would later escalate into the Vietnam War. During Eisenhower's administration, American advisors were in South Vietnam. They were there to advise and train the local soldiers. Now, Colt AR-15 models were named Colt 601 and 602. These were basically duplicates of the original Armalite rifle, but they had flatter, lower receivers without raised surfaces around the magazine well. Now, gun runners were rampant as ever, and the Colt 601 and 602 had found their way into the hands of locals in South Vietnam. Finally, through some indirect channels, the AR-15 started to see its first military use. The US Army research operation brought about 1,000 units of the AR-15 and dispersed them across the military landscape. One of the groups who received a batch for research purposes was a battalion of Rangers operating in South Vietnam. The Rangers who used the AR-15 under combat conditions thought it was a great weapon, so finally the rifle was getting some real exposure. Little by little the AR-15 became more known. The troops who used it immediately liked it. Its lightweight, its automatic fire capabilities, and its accuracy made it ideal for combat in jungle situations. The troops who were in Vietnam were praising the AR-15. And the word of this assault rifle got to the newly appointed Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara. McNamara and his team saw great potential for the mass production of the AR-15, and after learning of the rifle's history with the US Army and its committees, he decided to make a move. McNamara ordered the military officials to begin distributing the AR-15 to the troops, and the High Command had no choice but to adhere. The higher-ups at the Army, Air Force and Marines were told to cooperate with McNamara and his team, and the military was asked to make the AR-15 combat ready as soon as possible. However, the military's weapon development program clashed with the desires of McNamara and the defense community with which he represented. McNamara's team had veto privileges, and so they had the power to make all of the final decisions, often overruling the military officials in the process. So the AR-15 was renamed the M16, and in its official military incarnation, several changes were made. First, because the military used ball powder as opposed to stick powder, the cartridges used for the M16 had a bit more of a kick. This gave them the ability to reach even longer ranges, and as we know, the Army loves those long ranges. Second, there was now a left and a right hand grip. Another new feature was the appearance of a 3-prong flash suppressor as well as a thicker barrel. While the M16 was being developed and tested in the US, the situation in Vietnam was escalating. It was 1962 and the number of American military advisors in South Vietnam had shot up from 700 to 12,000. It seemed like another war was just around the corner. In 1963, North Vietnam was acquiring more and more territory, and there was civil unrest, protests, and demonstrations. Buddhist priests were burning themselves alive, and the number of US military advisors reached 15,000. In October of 1963, there was a coup, and the president of South Vietnam was assassinated just 3 weeks before JFK was assassinated. In the summer of 1964, North Vietnamese boats engaged an American destroyer by the name of USS Maddox. In March 1965, the first batch of combat troops were headed into the jungles of Vietnam. More troops were on the way, and the need for a new kind of standard-issue assault rifle was becoming more and more apparent. The M16 was about to go to war. At the end of 1965, there were nearly 500,000 US troops in Vietnam. The M16s were constantly being produced, and 1 year later, the M16 became the standard-issue rifle of the US Army. After several months of use, there were reports of malfunctions, the rifles were jamming, the troops were not happy with the performance of the M16. Combined with the fact that many of the troops were not sufficiently trained in operating the weapon, the M16 was turning out to be a problem. Furthermore, the Army didn't even bother to issue cleaning kits to the soldiers, claiming the M16 to be the world's only self-cleaning gun. The result of the Army's policy was a complete mess. Soldiers would fire and dirt would start to accumulate. Later, the weapon would malfunction due to the buildup of grime and dirt. So after a Missouri senator launched a full-scale investigation, it was found that the change in gunpowder was the main cause of jams in the M16. Another big problem was the chamber was not chrome-plated. This caused serious problems and was one of the most common reasons for the M16 to jam. Now, coating the rifle's chamber with chrome was a well-known technique for rust and corrosion prevention. It was McNamara's team who had vetoed the idea of a chrome-plated chamber when it was proposed by the Army. Their assumption was that if a chrome-plated chamber was essential, Stoner would have made it part of the original design. There was a lot of finger-pointing going on, the Army blaming McNamara's team and vice versa. Essentially, McNamara himself was not to blame. He had ordered the Army to get this weapon ready for battle, and they did not execute that order properly. The M16 was clearly not combat ready. The Army began issuing cleaning kits on the double as well as fitting M16s with chrome-plated chambers. Within 12 months, the number of malfunctions had significantly diminished. Those who arrived to fight in the jungles of Vietnam from 1967 onwards had very few problems with the M16. As long as the soldier kept his gun clean and maintained, there was very little cause for it to jam. When America left Vietnam in the 70s, the M16 was already known all over the world as a reliable, tested, combat-proven assault rifle. The United States still uses variants of the M16, and so it is a symbol and staple of the American Armed Forces. Well guys, that's pretty much it. I'm going to end off things here as Rising Storm 2 Vietnam doesn't use any newer versions of the weapon. Anyways, if you enjoyed my video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for future content. Until next time guys, take care of yourselves and have a chilled one.